Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for your interest and enthusiasm in this session. I am so delighted that today we are hosting Dr. Christine Martineau, our Educational Development Consultant in Indigenous Ways of Knowing, to discuss Indigenous Ways of Knowing and program design. This is the last workshop in the 23-24 series, and just I think the perfect way to close us out. So welcome Christine, she's going to take over, but I'll be monitoring the chat and we'll just, get started.
Great. Thank you, Jaclyn. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out today. Very happy to be presenting for you today and hoping to get to know many of you in person. I know some of you, hoping to get to know the rest of you over the course of the coming year. So we're going to start. It's going to be a kind of a jam-packed presentation today, kind of a bit of a knowledge bomb on you, but it's really just to give you that overall picture of where to start, what to do. I'm aiming this at a beginner level because I don't know where everyone's at in this process, and so we can adapt from there in terms of understanding. Just going to get my slides to go. So I'll acknowledge that the University of Calgary, which is located in the heart of southern Alberta, both acknowledges and pays tribute to these territories and the peoples of Treaty 7, including the Blackfoot Confederacy, which is the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney, and also the Métis Nation of Alberta, specifically Districts 5 and 6, which are located in Calgary. And I'm going to slip over to my introduction in a minute and make this a little more personal in terms of how I'm connected to the land. But first, I just want to go through the learning objectives for this session. So I'm hoping that you will develop or deepen your understanding of the following: Indigenous knowledges, cultures, identity, and pedagogy in relation to teaching and learning, why truth and reconciliation matters, and then the introduction to the tah'poh'to'p Indigenous strategy from the University of Calgary, and then go through some resources that can help in your planning and development in your own programs and areas. So I'm going to stop sharing this here and switch over to another share in order to introduce myself to you. Just have to find my, there we go, my presentation button. Come on, work with me. All right. So I always start with my context, my family context, because some of you might wonder what this woman looking like me is doing talking about Indigenous ways of knowing. And through my introduction, you'll find out that it's because we have many generations that are mixed Indigenous and European Canadians. And this is how it rolled out in the genetic tumbling of the dice for me. So if you haven't figured it out, I'm the little blonde in the middle. And I like to provide this just so that you understand where I'm coming from and how I come to have this knowledge and experience. So my cultural roots are Cree, Métis, Dene Southlene, or Chipewyan from Cold Lake area, and then English, French, and Irish as well. Some of our family names, Martineau, of course, the name I still carry, Harris, Janvier, DeMars, Smith, Whitford, Spence. So as you can see, a real mixture of names and cultures from which people come. So to start with where those people first landed on this continent, the European folks have to go to northern Manitoba and Ontario, to York Factory and Fort Severn, where my mom's people first came, the Whitfords from England. And as many did in the Hudson's Bay Company, the first thing that the first Whitford did was marry a Cree woman and start a Métis family, essentially, from there. They settled, as many other Hudson's Bay Company folks did, in the Red River settlement and intermarried with other Métis families and really were at the genesis of the development of Métis culture and identity in Canada. My dad's grandfather came from Sandy Bay in Manitoba, and he was Métis also. So Martineau, his folks came from France through Montreal, and again intermarried and started moving west. So here is the territory that really is home to my people, I would say, and that is in northern Alberta, both in Métis areas and on First Nations throughout. So all of them ended up in this particular area, which we now call Treaty 6 in northern Alberta. My dad was born at Cold Lake First Nation. Our membership is actually to Frog Lake First Nations. And that's a longer story that I won't share today, but just that reclaiming identity and the government's role in determining where you belong. And then an important area in this, as a smaller version of this map, if you look at the North Saskatchewan and look west of Saddle Lake there along the river, Victoria Settlement was the first home of my mom's Métis ancestors, the Whitford family, who came out and settled that area. So the town of Andrew is named after Andrew Whitford. There's also a Whitford Lake in that area. And today, Métis Crossing is very near where the old Victoria settlement was, and it actually incorporates parts of it. So that's just a little bit of context. And then I was actually born and raised in Calgary. And so spent a lot of my developing years in this region and a great deal of my teaching career also. I taught at Siksika First Nation. I taught at Eden Valley, out at the Stoney Nakoda west of here at what is now called Manithni. So this is really, when I talk about my relations to the land, they really encompass many treaty areas and many Métis districts. Family are both status and Métis mixed throughout. That's just a little bit about me. So now I'm going to stop sharing that, and maybe I have some relatives. If I do, if anybody's related, give a shout out and a wave. And now I want to go to, so what I thought we'd start with today is just sort of a primer on what is Indigenous knowledge, what are Indigenous perspectives, and what are we to do with that. And so I have a presentation that I've been offering that's based on my doctoral research that I use to start that off. So some of you will be familiar with some of this content, but for many of you, it will be new. So let me just get back up to start. That's showing up all right. Good. Okay. So just a bit of an introduction to Indigenous knowledge. I have an image here to help you think about how Indigenous knowledge has been recorded. And what that image should bring to mind is a different form of literacy and a different way of thinking about the world and our role within it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that image as I go along. So just a bit of an overview of this presentation. What is Indigenous knowledge? From where does it originate? Why does it matter? What are some of its attributes? And then why are we doing truth and reconciliation? What is the impetus for bringing Indigenous perspectives into curriculum and programming at the university? So this is really out of my literature review for my dissertation and looked at some of the preeminent Indigenous thinkers and their descriptions of Indigenous knowledge and its uses and origins. So I've got a few different ones here. And one of the resources I use also is the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. So the report of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which came out in 1996, which was a really extensive review of Indigenous peoples and our relationship with Canada and Canadians in this colonial context. It's very underutilized, in fact. It didn't get the traction that the TRC report did, but it's a really great resource for those of you wanting to dig into particular areas because it's very all-encompassing in terms of the topics that it delves into. So when we think about Indigenous knowledge, we understand that it comprises all aspects of life and living. It's a holistic paradigm that is deeply tied to both community and culture. It's the accumulated wisdom, technology, and experience of Indigenous peoples. It's very systemic and holistic, so it encompasses everything that can be thought or observed. And importantly, it's both process and content. And that will become important in today's presentation because we tend to focus more on what content can I bring in to my course, my program, my lesson. But I really want to encourage you to think also about processes because those are very different in Indigenous ways and they're an important part of the Indigenous strategy. Indigenous knowledge is indigenous to this land, and therefore it is the North American intellectual tradition. And stating it in that way is a really important aspect of revitalizing Indigenous knowledge, to say this is the knowledge system of this land. So if you want to dig into knowing this land better, then Indigenous people are the place to start with that understanding, because this is our intellectual tradition. So where does it come from? For Indigenous people, knowledge, like everything else, emanates from the Creator. So it's created, knowledge is created. And it comes to us in two primary ways. And these are, you will see that these are opposite to the way we think about where knowledge comes from a Canadian, from that Canadian scientific perspective that relies on Western ways of knowing and that classical, sorry, that's the word I was looking for, the classical tradition that goes back to ancient Rome and Greece. So objective knowledge for us is that knowledge that comes directly from the Creator. It comes to us through our prayers, our dreams, our visions, and our insights. It's the source of our sacred laws that govern our relationships with community and the world at large. And it's also the source of our traditions and sacred ceremonies. And the whole goal of our knowledge system is to help us lead a good life. And we will dig into more of what that means. So that's the most reliable knowledge for Indigenous people, is that we receive directly. Subjective knowledge is the knowledge that we acquire through our experiences in the physical world and in community. It's what we learn by doing, and therefore is subject to our experiences in our interpretations. And so it sits subordinate to that objective knowledge that comes directly from Creator. We learn subjectively through our relationships with community, with the natural world, which for us as Indigenous peoples also includes all, so human life and more than human life, spirits, the land itself, and all forms of life. And so as the late Joe Couture described this, there is no such thing as supernatural in a Cree context, that everything is considered part of the natural world. And so it's all of that. It's the entire cosmos that we think about when we're talking about the world in that respect. So Indigenous knowledge grows then out of our experiences, both spiritual and physical and communal, and is mediated by our language, our languages, that should really be plural, languages and cultures. And so languages and cultures are both repositories, but also normative functions for how we understand the world. So they hold our knowledge and then they give it back to us as we study and come to learn deeply about our own languages and cultures. So this is an image that came to mind for me. This spiral is a really important concept in Indigenous worldviews. And I think it's particularly appropriate when we're talking about learning. And that is that we may be returning to similar concepts and teachings over and over again, but the idea is that that knowledge will continue to expand out. And so this is really rooted in that cyclical worldview that is a very Indigenous way of looking at the world. So Indigenous knowledge is communal and collective. Here's a quote from Willie Ermine. He says, "The old ones, our ancestors, experienced inwardness as a totality And that's what created community, that the individuals are a physical manifestation of the life force. We are created and we're imbued with spirit and connected to all that is. And the people have become empowered to become the culture of accumulated knowledge. And we'll talk a bit about that idea of culture and how that relates to identity and what this endeavor is about. So the community forms an essential function as that repository and incubator of all the knowledge in the form of custom and culture. So when we have specific protocols, those are based off of principles that are derived from natural law. So from observing and coming to understand how other systems in our world work and adopting those principles for ourselves. We also believe strongly that we have a narrative memory that is intergenerational and collective. And that's very typical for an oral culture, that culture of orality is not the absence of writing, but in fact, a different way of thinking and communicating within and about the world. And we'll touch on that a little more later on. So collective narrative memory is what really puts our singular lives into that larger context. Where do I belong? Who are my people? Where is my place on the earth? Indigenous knowledge doesn't live external to Indigenous people. It lives within us and germinates and grows within community. And so when you're bringing in Indigenous knowledge, it means that you need to also be bringing in Indigenous people as the holders of that knowledge. And so really, I want you to think about your role if you are not Indigenous and think, well, what is my role in this? It's really to come to learn about these worldviews and how they might connect to your particular subject areas and disciplines and practices, and say, how can I, in what ways can I bring that in? Whether it's through actually bringing human beings into your classes to do that teaching, you are the facilitator of those learning experiences. You might be bringing it in the readings that you provide, in other media that's available to your students. So again, it's an embodied knowledge that lives within us. And here we talk about primary orality, which is a specialized topic that Dr. Cora Weber-Pillwax, a Cree Métis elder and scholar, has explored quite a bit. And so she describes primary orality as the systems of language use and thinking patterns that determine and guide all forms of our social interaction and individual development. So again, it's not just the fact that we don't read and write. It's not a subtraction. It's a variation of thinking. And so you'll see particular forms in how oral knowledge is presented. It's also cyclical, circular, and comes back to concepts and principles for expanded understanding over time. And that's part of that structuring of the brain. And this structure, research is starting to show that structuring of the brain from an oral culture actually lasts several generations beyond the language. So even though I'm not fluent in Cree today, it was my father's first language. And so that has helped pattern how I see and think about and process the world, if that helps make sense of that. So moving from orality then to literacy, a different way of recording and exploring information, is not just a matter of language translation. It really involves a different way of thinking, communicating, and relating through an oral consciousness. And so that's something to understand when you're working with Indigenous people and perhaps encountering communication issues and wondering, how does all of this relate? How can I put this into English words in that sense? Another important aspect of Indigenous knowledge is relationships. And you'll notice I have an image of the spider web there. And I think that's a common metaphor for how we think about the interrelatedness of all things that exist And the idea that if you take an action on one part of that web, that it will have an impact in other parts. And so that's part of your understanding before you act, is to say, how will this impact all that is? So Leroy Little Bear, Kainai elder, says that the interrelationships between all entities are of paramount importance. That's where we start in the world, is in our relationships. Our relatedness to Earth and all of its inhabitants puts us in relationship with everything, including the spiritual realm. These relationships are all described in our languages, which are considered sacred gifts given to us. And the fundamental insight of an Indigenous worldview is that all existence is connected, and the whole enmeshes the being in its inclusiveness. And that's really, I think, a very different way of thinking about the individual, that it's not a choice of where you belong, it's the place from which you spring. So that's your place, that's where you're connected. And you're enmeshed in all of that culture and community, ways of knowing, being, doing, and connecting. So that is the starting point for thinking about Aboriginal epistemology. It's this mysterious force that in Cree we call it the Great Mystery, that connects us to the totality of existence, forms, energies, and concepts that constitute both the outer and the inner worlds. And that's another important concept of indigeneity, is that when we want to seek to know something, one of the important directions to travel to is inward. And that's, again, tapping into that spirit-based knowledge that can be directly revealed to us. And so that's where our ceremonies become essential to some aspects and many aspects of our learning. There are also very different understandings of space and time. And so, and what's interesting to me is that this knowledge for us is thousands of years old, perhaps tens of thousands of years old. And yet science is confirming so much of it, particularly in the last century. And so this idea of all things being in constant motion or flux is an Indigenous concept of how the world works. Now think about how science has come to describe that, that reality as well. So if everything is constantly moving and changing, then we have to look at the whole in order to begin to see the patterns emerge. That constant motion is manifested in cyclical and repetitive patterns. That is, again, an important place where we say this emphasizes process as opposed to product. And so that really becomes important in thinking about pedagogy. It's not what product are you trying to produce, but what process of learning are you taking your students through? So having more say in the processes and really letting the product unfold in each individual learner. Thinking about the world this way results in a concept of time that is dynamic. Time is certainly dynamic, and that it's changing and flowing, but without motion, that time just is. It doesn't go anywhere. And so this is part of that understanding that I can tap into the past, the present, and the future in this moment through Indigenous pedagogy and Indigenous ways of being. We tend to envision our collective memory in terms of space rather than time. And so that's where that sense of place becomes really important. When we talk about learning on the land, with the land, and from the land, it's not land in general, it's land in particular. So where are we on the land? And what do we need to know from this place? So it's very rooted in that sense of place. And many of our learning activities involve going back to those important places to tell the stories and learn from the stories of those places. So that brings us to the land and place and thinking about both of those concepts. Indigenous knowledge is tied to particular lands and particular places, and our names often reflect that. If you translate many of our names for ourselves, they often translate to, we are the people of this particular place. So the people of the river, for example, are the people who live along the North Saskatchewan, the Cree people who live along the North Saskatchewan. They define themselves by living along that river. The relationship that Aboriginal people have with Turtle Island, North America, that's our Indigenous name for North America, is governed by rules and principles that were formed in the distant past. And that the Creator preordained how our relationship with that land would be, and provided us the tools and the means to live a life that expressed that relationship. So living in concert with, in relationship with, and according to the patterns of the natural world is what it means to live in an Indigenous way. We see the earth literally as our mother, because that is where our existence originates and is sustained. We get our nutrients from her. And that's the source of our being. Our being cannot be separated from her. And so you can really see that playing out today in the lengths that Indigenous peoples are willing to go to fight for the integrity, maintaining the integrity of our mother, the earth, because she is us and we are her. So it's a deeply intimate relationship. And so creation, we understand creation as a continuity. And in order for it to continue, it must be renewed. And so we have our ceremonies at particular times in particular places in concert with that cycle of the earth. We renew those relationships on a regular basis to remind us of the deep importance of remembering that relationship to the earth, our mother. So paradigms or worldviews. An Aboriginal paradigm includes these ideas of constant flux. So again, that shifting, flowing motion, that all existence consists of energy and waves and spirit. All things are animate. Everything is alive. Everything is imbued with spirit. And because of that, everything is interrelated. And therefore, creation and existence have to be renewed. Again, so this is a bit of a summary of what I just presented. Space and place are important reference. Language, songs, stories, and ceremonies are repositories of knowledge. Indigenous knowledge is derived from communal experience, environmental observation, information received, and visions attained through ceremonies and communion with the spirits. That's from Greg Kahati, he's a Pueblo scholar in the United States who delves into Indigenous perspectives in science and in teaching and learning. So if you're looking for a good source, he's got several books out there. So Greg Kahati. So here's a summary list. And I include this because it really shows the depth of those characteristics of Indigenous knowledge. I've spoken to all of these throughout the little bit of the literature review that I've given you, but here they are contained in a list. And so it's just an easy reference to go back to. I'm not going to go through it again, but really a resource for you to use. Now, principles. These principles are assertions of Indigenous knowledge, and they come again from those observations of the natural world and how it operates and what we've learned from Creator or the Great Spirit or the Great Mystery about how to live in good ways. So first of all, we are all related. All existence is alive, has energy and spirit. There is a mysterious force that connects all of existence. Life is in constant flux. Community is a physical manifestation of the life force. So we are the life force manifest, each of us as individuals. Good relationships are essential. We are in relationship with the land. Earth is literally our mother. All creation must be renewed. The quest for knowledge is inward. We rely on spirit power more so than physical power. And understanding must be grounded in the spirit. Prayer is a principal way of seeking knowledge, as are dreams and ceremonies. And you could include stories, dances, and so forth. So all of culture is a way of passing on that knowledge, but also holding it and keeping it for subsequent generations. So we'll go back to that image here on this slide, that image that was shared, examples of Indigenous knowledge. And that image is a story robe. And I need to update it actually to the University of Calgary's story robe because we have our own now. And so this is a record. This is an encyclopedia. It's an ethnography. It's a history of a people, and it's recorded in particular ways. So that's a buffalo hide, and we're looking at the soft inside of the buffalo hide. You can see a bit of the fur hanging over in the top left corner, so you can imagine that the fur is still on that side. And you see that important spiral. And so a winter count is where the historian of a community would be the keeper of this and would add a symbol for every winter that the people survive, every winter of their story. A symbol is added that encapsulates the primary theme of that year and then becomes a mnemonic for that historian to be able to recount to the tribe, to the community, the important aspects of life that happened within them. So that's a way of storytelling. So to start reading this, you start at the center where you can see there are 6 lodges there together, and that's the beginning of these people's story. And then a new symbol for every year that they were a community, and that flows out. So it's very similar to the way that we see that the natural world also records history. And the trees of a ring are a common one that we point to. So not only from that cross section of a tree, we can count how old the tree is, but we can also look at the quality of its life over time. So where the rings are very narrow, those were times of less nutrients, suboptimal conditions for growth. Where the rings are thicker, that was a high growth year where the ecosystem was just right and allowed for optimal growth. We can see injuries and how those actually create scars in that record. So markers of what happened. And then we can see how we as human beings are also modeled after that same concept when you compare in the bottom image the rings of a tree to the human fingerprint. And so again, these are all images in the natural world that Indigenous people have adopted as the way to tell our stories. Our languages are important aspects of this, and I'm not going to dig too deeply into them today, except these few points that I want to go through. So our languages define the world for us. They contain our history. They contain the knowledge. So when you start to explore a particular word, you really start to understand more about the worldview. They capture a worldview that's specific to a culture, pass on what it means to be a member. Speaking the language is an important marker of identity that many of us have lost in the loss of our Indigenous languages. They provide meaning to life, cognitive bonds that affect our lives. They live deep within our processes, and as I said earlier, are not easily eradicated in that the thinking patterns remain, even if the words do not. That our languages have a spirit or soul of their own. They have cultural philosophies and beliefs embedded within them. They embody the way a society thinks and give us a vocabulary to explain our existence. So their reanimation and survival is critically important to the survival of Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous peoples. So now I want to, this is getting into the why does this matter? Why do we need to bring Indigenous perspectives into learning, into our teaching and learning? For what purposes? And it really goes back to what's happened to us as Indigenous people and our identities throughout the processes of colonization. So an important part of my study was understanding identity and what its purposes are. Why does it matter to have a fully developed identity? And what happens if you don't? And so the elders that I spoke with talked about our roots, and they talked about 6 different roots specifically. So our people, that's a very common understanding that our people are our roots, but our roots also are our histories, our languages, our knowledge systems, our ceremonies, and our lands, the lands where we come from. So those are all important aspects of our identity. And this is, of course, a Cree perspective, but you can see that there would be commonalities to other First Nations perspectives because there's a core understanding of that connectedness to the world through the earth and all that exists. For Cree people, we think of ourselves as 4-part people. So those 4 parts are the spiritual, mental, physical, and emotional aspects of the human being. So that's an important aspect of identity. And that our identity develops by interacting with the roots. So interacting with our people, learning our history, speaking our languages, learning about our knowledge system and enacting that knowledge and adding to it and expanding it, by participating in our ceremonies, by being in relation to the land. That's how our identity develops. And then we're able to express that by speaking our languages, praying our prayers, doing our ceremonies, and all of those other cultural traditions that come out. And the purposes of our identity are primarily to locate us as to where we belong. Belonging is one of the primary needs of a human being. And so that's what identity is about, that you belong to these people at this time in this place. It also protects us through our connection to those roots, through knowing who we are and having a strong sense of belonging. It's hard to have your identity assaulted when it's strongly developed in you and you believe in the strength of that. And then finally, our identity development is to guide us in fulfilling our purpose of living a balanced, good life. We are born with that identity, as you know from studying high school science, that your DNA is encoded in every cell of your body, that it's physical, mental, spiritual, and emotional all at once, and that we live in this ecosystem of culture. And when I explain the importance of culture here, I want you to think about culture in the lab. If you want to grow something in the science lab, you take a piece of the organism and you put it in a culture. And what is that culture? It's an optimal environment with all of the needs required to develop. And so this comes to a lesson that I learned from the trees in my neighborhood. And I start with this. This is actually a tree in my backyard. It's a weeping birch tree. And you can see that it's trying to thrive, but the whole center, the main trunk, is really dying off. Yet it still gets all these branches on the outside, but that center core of the trunk is just not thriving at all. And I had an arborist out doing some work for me, and I said, what can I do for that tree? What does it need? What's the matter with that tree that it's not thriving? And he said to me, here's another example of one in my neighborhood. And he said, that tree belongs in a swamp. And I said, I don't live in a swamp. There's the weeping birch in its natural habitat. Look at the difference between my tree in West Edmonton and this tree living right along the water so that its branches drip right down and touch the surface of that water. That's what it should look like if it were able to fully express its identity, if it were able to develop in an optimal environment. But instead, It's in an environment that's more optimal for a spruce tree. And that has important implications for weeping birch trees, but also for human beings. So when we are taken out of our culture, our cultural medium, taken out of our optimal ecosystem, and forbidden any expression of our identity, we are not able to thrive. And so if you think about, if you took a little sapling, cut off its roots, cut off its branches, you have a stick. Can't really call it a tree at that point. Put it in another environment that's meant to develop another organism, and it might grow, but it's probably not going to thrive in that environment. And so what happens is it looks a lot like the weeping birch in my backyard, doing its best to express itself. So as a Cree person, I do my best to express myself. But without that identity development, I don't know what that means. I don't know what it looks like. I don't know how to live a good life. I have a distorted and underdeveloped identity that becomes diffused, is still under constant assault, and it results in this dysfunctional expression and dis-ease. And still, society keeps rejecting us as foreign. And then Indigenous people are blamed for the outcomes of that assault on their identity and confirmation of their inferiority. And so this is really those outcomes of the residential school system, of the 60s scoop, the millennial scoop, and the ongoing oppression that Indigenous people live under in Canada. And so this is a direct quote down here. What happens in these schools, in these programs, the government said, we're not really fundamentally changing them. What we're ending up with is savages who can read and write. And so you can see that hostile view of indigeneity. And so that means that we really need to shift our policy focus from putting band-aids on all those branches. I mean, that's important, healing, but also reconceptualizing the roots of what we're doing. And that's where bringing in Indigenous knowledge, languages, perspectives, and ways of doing, being, and connecting becomes really important. We're actually changing the root system so that that identity can thrive going forward. So there's some important aspects of Indigenous pedagogy, but I'm just going to speed this up a little bit. Oscar Coagli, the late UPIC educator and elder, said, for our people, there's only one goal for education, and that is to produce a human being. So remembering that we're not teaching subject matter, we're teaching human beings, and helping them to come to understand that subject matter is a really important, and it sounds a little cliche and simple, but it's an important paradigmatic shift in your responsibility as an educator. So how can you do this? You can become a facilitator of learning experiences rather than feeling like you have to be a knower of all things. You don't have to know this knowledge to the degree necessary that an Indigenous scholar would know. What you need to know is where and when and who you can tap into as resources to help bring that in. That land and place are primal to learning and understanding. So getting out of the classroom is one way. That creation is our primary teacher. Sorry, the garbage men are going through the alley. I hope you can't hear them right now. Apologies. Teaching and learning occur within our relationships between teacher and student, subject and student, land and student, spirit world and student. So learning in this way is a holistic endeavor that requires engaging all aspects of the student and teacher to develop understanding and skills in those four realms of being. So you want to create interactions for students with the roots of their identity, places where they can bring in aspects of their cultural ecosystem or do their learning in that culture and ecosystem. Ceremonies are integral to that. Indigenous languages are important, and learning is a lifelong process of becoming, both being and becoming. So when you think about that, that's another concept that the late Joe Couture digs into, of being and becoming. I am, but I also am becoming. more than that. So that lifelong growth is important. So how do we get started? Here's the nuts and bolts from me. The first part is to figure out the why. And that's why I like to present what I've just presented to you, to help you understand, why do we do this? And then what motivates you specifically to want to do this? What are you interested in? What do you already know? Where are you? And who are the people? So those are important starting places. Who do you have existing relationships with? How can you develop those connections, strengthen them, have them enhance your teaching? And then choose an area of focus. Don't try to learn it all. Think of, what area would I really like to know more about from an Indigenous perspective, and explore that. And that becomes the doorway into the rest of your learning. So choose a theme. I have each area because I talk about the importance of not only learning about Indigenous cultures, but also about what happened to us. So this is the truth and reconciliation. We have to understand what we're undoing. And so choose an area both from culture and from history and explore those in depth. Work in learning groups to maximize your learning potential. Find resources that present Indigenous perspectives. Evaluate those. Ask yourself, who is speaking? Where are they positioned? Who is seen and heard? Who is not? And why might that be? So just a quick way of evaluating some of the resources that you're bringing in. Always acknowledging the sources of your knowledge and understanding and teaching. So who taught you that? Reference those just like you would towards an academic. Don't fall into this trap of evaluating cultures and beliefs. We have a tendency to want to do that when we're teaching. And here it's really just, they're different. It's not better or worse. They're different ways of approaching the world. Commit to your own learning and development, and you will get out what you put in. Okay, I'm going to move into the next set of slides, the final set of slides, and if questions are coming up as we go, please just pop your hand up and Jaclyn will interrupt me. So I'm going to go back to my sharing. Oops. Oi, sorry. Clickety click. I want back to this one. There it is. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about tah'poh'to'p, the Indigenous strategy that the University of Calgary has developed and has committed to implementing. So just a little bit of the background on it. University of Calgary has committed to establishing a welcoming, inclusive, and culturally competent campus community. Wow, that's a alliteration. That respects, includes, and promotes Indigenous ways of knowing, teaching, learning, and research. Those also include experiential learning that has an essential role in the transformation and renewal of campus and as a path toward reconciliation. tah'poh'to'p is a Blackfoot word, specifically a Kainai word, I've been told, that means this is a place to rest and rejuvenate during a journey. And I think that's a beautiful metaphor for what a university education is. It's that time to stop and learn and refresh and better understand. So it was gifted in ceremony and is embedded in the Indigenous strategy as its name. So tah'poh'to'p, or the Indigenous strategy. It acknowledges again the positionality of the university, and that this, because we acknowledge where we are on the land and who those peoples are, it necessitates a principle of good relationships, good relations, to guide its relationship with the people. And understanding that universities historically have been a source of that diminishment of indigeneity, diminishment of Indigenous knowledge systems, and so forth. And so it's important that we bring that back in. This principle is foundational to the strategy in that together we share the land, strive to live together, learn together, walk together, and grow together in a good way. It's founded on Indigenous conceptions and perspectives of the universe that are governed by those dynamic cycles of transformation and renewal. And it's based on 4 visionary circles: ways of knowing, ways of doing, ways of connecting, and ways of being. So here's a set of guidelines and recommendations, and I'm just going to give you a little touch on this, and then I've got a link for you right in the slides to the actual document that this comes from. So these guidelines and recommendations provide an overview of these different dimensions, and we acknowledge that we're at the beginning of this process and it's going to be ongoing, and that the tah'poh'to'p will be a living strategy to guide us. So ways of knowing includes teaching, learning, and research. So how do you come to know? And we've looked at some of those concepts from Indigenous perspectives. Ways of doing. So this would include policies, procedures, and practices. And one of the terms embedded in the strategy is the idea of parallel practices. And so these are, as they are described, live parallel to the processes that we already engage in. So how can we have mainstream processes in university, but also have parallel Indigenous paths through? And so one of them might be the ways in which students present their understanding to you. Does it always have to be a paper or a report? Can it be an oral presentation? Those kinds of things. So what are the parallel practices that you embed in your programs? Ways of connecting. So again, all of those relationships, seeing relating as the core of being human, as the core of being, in fact, and how can you represent that in your courses and programs? And then, of course, ways of being, and that includes being a spiritual being. So incorporating that aspect of your being emotional, being physical, being cognitive in that. So really thinking beyond what we typically think about of ways of knowing and being in the classroom. Transformation is a core concept and goal of tah'poh'to'p, so that and the university says that at a basic level, transformation begins with ensuring that Indigenous people in our university community see themselves reflected here and feel like they belong. We remain underrepresented in the community. And so thinking about how can you increase Indigenous engagement and enrollment in your courses and programs. And also requires many of us to challenge and change some of the negative attitudes and feelings and conceptualizations that we have learned about Indigenous people through the colonial project. We all hold them and we all have to challenge them. And so that's that self-development is an important part of this process. You must also be shifting the way you're thinking about this as you're shifting the way you do it in your teaching and learning. And then the commitment to renewal, that this strategy will be routinely evaluated in terms of progress. So we have an annual reporting period for that. We also have a parallel process that involves a ceremony. So it's not just presenting the report, but it's also bringing it into ceremony with the elders who helped create the strategy and having them validate it. So that's one of the parallel processes that's engaged with. And that renewal will also require designated leadership and accountability, resource allocation, and infrastructure. And so I take this commitment at face value from the University of Calgary, and it says they're putting their money where their mouth is in terms of our ability to do this. And there are sources of money and other resources that are available to us. So parallel paths requires that there are paths between Indigenous perspectives and Eurocentric perspectives, and we can find a pathway in a good way to maintain good relations within those in authentic and meaningful ways. And we do that with clarity of purpose and high levels of morality and integrity with a communal spirit to guide us. So those are excerpts from this document, Recommendations for Program Proposal Development, which I've hyperlinked for you. So we can explore some of those recommendations, and I will open that link in a minute. I just want to show you what else I've got in the slide for you. Here's the Office of Indigenous Engagement, and that's also hyperlinked so that you understand the supports that they provide. And we've got Norma here with us, Norma Jeremica Gressel, who is, sorry, Norma, I forget your title at the Office of Indigenous Engagement, so sorry.
No worries. It's Manager for Community Outreach and Program Development.
Thank you. And so Norma is a wonderful resource for all of us, and we try to work very closely in our work together. So if you're putting a new program through a review process, you're going to come in contact with one or both of us at least one time. So we'll have a look at that. And then also there's a whole slew of resources, including videos on core concepts if you want to explore these more, particularly from a Blackfoot worldview, that were created by Gabriel Lindstrom, Dr. Gabriel Lindstrom, who was in this position prior to me. And so there's some important resources there. And then the last piece I have to share with you is a draft of the new experiential learning framework. And so that's the one, because if you can engage in experiential learning, you're really going to be hitting on the key points of the Indigenous strategy, because our revision of it is to align it more closely with that. So I think that's what I want to spend the last few minutes going through, is just that experiential learning framework and how that can be a starting place for you, and then entertain some questions and comments that you might have. So let me just find the document. Sorry, shifting gears again. There we go. Good. Okay, so some shifts to the experiential learning framework. I won't go through the history of it. And this is going to have a permanent home soon and be shared. It's just got to go through a couple more review processes, but it's essentially in the form that we want it to be. So a new definition of experiential learning is that experiential learning is learning by doing, being, connecting, and reflecting. So again, learning by doing. How are we doing hands-on learning? All of those things that we typically think about experiential learning or work integrated learning and those sorts of things. So learning by doing is still at the core of this. Very Indigenous pedagogy, as you've seen from the earlier presentation. And then thinking about learning by being. So being in a new environment, being in a community, being with yourself, being in a spiritual context. So just that shift in your understanding from being in a new place is also an important piece of learning. Learning by connecting. So this involves your relationships with self, with others, with creator, with the other spirit realms of the spiritual world, with the earth, with other beings within it. So connecting with others is an important form of learning, and learning by reflecting. So making meaning of all of that over time. And that reflection can be individual, it can be formal or informal, it can be amongst a group, talking circles, those sorts of things, but that reflection is built in to experiential learning. So experiential learning happens when knowledge and experience are bridged through that critical reflection. And I want to go down to the pieces of it. So we've used AIR as our new understanding of this framework, and it's just a little bit in the wrong order on this version. But anyway, authentic experience is the A. And so in situ, hands-on experiences, meaningful, relevant, embodied, and so forth. Intentionally designed for learning. What are you wanting to students to learn from this, and in which realms of learning? being, doing, knowing, connecting. And then finally, how are students set up to reflect in meaningful ways? Is the reflection ongoing and continuous? Does it challenge them to unpack their assumptions and biases and other perspectives that they may have learned? And now we have a continuum that has shifted a little bit. So if you've seen this before, I'm just going to slide down to the new vision of the continuum, where we've added an area of focus, and we've also added an environment. So for those who haven't seen this continuum before, across the top axis is the focus. So is it focus on innovation, on research, on knowledge, skills, and attribute development, on career, or on creative endeavors? And then down the other axis is the environment. Where is this taking place? In the classroom, in the studio, lab, or field, out in the greater social or natural world, on campus or in community, and in the workplace. And so we also provide a blank for you to start thinking about. And of course, you know, you might have more than one focus, and that's okay. And in fact, the more aspects of the ways of being that you're hitting in your learning activities, the more holistic it's going to become through that process, and the more effective by teaching the whole self. All right, so that was a lot, and I'm sorry for that, but it just seems like those are the pieces that I think are necessary to start to get a handle on where you might be able to go with this. So now I'd just like to open it up for questions, comments, so forth, on how you might go about this.
Maybe while people are gathering their thoughts, I could just kind of talk about the process that we use to engage experts like you, Christine, from the
Perfect.
Program Innovation Hub. So I know there are some individuals in the room who have gone through processes with us before, so you can maybe speak to this as well. But typically what will happen is at this stage, like pretty much all of the templates that we use for getting programs approved or making large scale curricular changes and things like that do ask about engagement with, at the very least, the Indigenous strategy at the University of Calgary, but also how Indigenous students and other minority groups are going to be supported through programs and things like that. And so it's really asking you to think about these things very early on in the process. And so we have supports in place in order to help you start thinking through some of these things. And one of them is, it would likely be me or someone else from the Program Innovation Hub team, Kelly Hoagland perhaps, or Elizabeth, or Karen, who would connect you with Christine as a way to have some of those early conversations about how to meaningfully incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing into your program's design. And in addition to that, Norma's team in the Office of Indigenous Engagement, we've been working with them pretty closely through Working Circle 4, which really looks at programs quite closely. And I know there's some individuals in this room who've brought forward their proposed programs to our Working Circle for some really comprehensive discussion. And that will include having the proponents think through some of the key questions about the Indigenous parts of their curriculum that they want reviewed and to get feedback on. So there are mechanisms in place before you even get to the approvals process with DST or with APS or GAPS as kind of a first stop to help you start thinking through some of these things and to ensure that you are well supported and connected as you develop your programs or make large scale program changes. So please take advantage, reach out to us if you're not sure where to start, and we can always facilitate some of those connections for you.
That was awesome, Jaclyn, because I still don't know what all those acronyms stand for.
That's
Being
fair.
new
There's
here,
lots
I'm
of them.
still...
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Norma, is there anything that you would like to add also?
Hi,
Put you on
everyone.
the spot.
No. Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, thank you. Beautiful presentation, beautiful storyline that you had there, Christine. I really love the work that you've done and the work that you are doing at the university, and I really appreciate working with you. I don't know really what else to add, except I think we're all, maybe everybody in this space now is just getting ready for the summer to take a break. But you know, summertime is the best time to think about land-based teaching. So think about opportunities, how you can explore land-based teaching in your curriculum coming up in the fall or even winter. And you know, Christine and I, we're open to conversations. Yeah, just connect with us. We're here to support you. And Working Circle 4 is actually taking a break during the summer, but we will be back in the fall. And what we do is we do offer space and time during our meetings. If a professor, or you know, if you have a curriculum or a course that you want to look at, how do I include Indigenous voices or Indigenous content, we can complete a questionnaire for us, for the committee, and we would invite you to the committee so you can do a presentation and you would get some guidance and directions from the committee members on maybe some things to consider, or you know, just to support you as you're making changes to your program. Thanks.
So some of the things you can do to reach out, you can email me at the Taylor Institute. It's christine.martineau@UCalgary. We can set up a one-on-one. I can come to your department meeting. I can come to your faculty. You know, there's just all different kinds of ways of engaging. We can do it virtually or on the ground in person. So please feel free to reach out. I will be here all of June working. And so if you want to consult over that month, that's a great time. May has been nuts in terms of stuff going on, but June loosens up quite a bit. And even if you just want to put a place marker in place for August or September, happy to do that as well, because I'm sure things will start to ramp up again. So reach out whenever you're ready, and happy to help walk forward. And as Jaclyn said, you know, we all work together in a variety of ways. I've worked with Kelly and worked with Norma and several others through the Working Circle 4, through my own engagement and through other opportunities. So don't feel like you have to know the right person. Just get in touch with one of us and we'll help you pull that together. I did hyperlink in the resources for those websites that I was talking about. So the Office of Indigenous Engagement is hyperlinked in there. That recommendations for approaching incorporating the Indigenous strategy. The only one that's not in there is the experiential learning framework. I'm just waiting for a fresh link for that. So I'll ask Jaclyn to email that out later once I get that, because we just did a couple of tweaks to it this morning. So I'll get a fresh link that we'll email out for you.
Thanks everyone for attending. As I mentioned, this is the last workshop in the series for this year, but all the recordings will be available within the next month, including all of the resources that we've used. So please check that website out when you can. Thanks everyone.